Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Matthew Monger. We're going to be talking about the Sumerian Kings list and Genesis. So, Dr. Monger made a video on this very topic on his YouTube channel. The Bible was written backwards, and he made a lot of interesting, really points about how they're extremely very. It's okay. I'll edit this one out too. He made a lot of really interesting points on the similarities between the texts, and I thought it'd be really important to talk about these, discuss the significance, discuss more details about the similarities and differences and what they mean and how we should be reading these two texts. So, how are we doing today, Dr. Matthew Munger?
I'm doing great. How are you, Zach?
I am doing great. All right. So, to get into it, I just wanted to play your video just to give us some intro context into the different topic, and then we'll discuss like similarities, differences, all that afterwards.
Hey, everybody. It's Dr. Matt Munger, and I'm here with another episode of The Bible Was Written Backwards. Today, I want to look at a couple of texts that probably get skimmed over or skipped when you're reading through the chapters of the beginning of Exodus. Exodus.
Of course, what he meant to say was Genesis.
Namely, chapters 4 and 5, which have the genealogies of Cain in chapter 4 and of Seth in chapter 5. So I want to look at these from two different perspectives today. First of all, I want to compare these two texts together. So we'll look at them from a kind of comparative perspective within the Bible. And then we're going to look at some Sumerian parallels that might help us understand a little bit about how ancient peoples were thinking about the time that is as far back in history as you can go. We'll begin by looking at the texts. First of all, Genesis 4, 17 to 18 lists the names of Cain's descendants.
Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. And he built a city, and named it Enoch after his son Enoch. To Enoch was born Irad, and Irad was the father of Mehujael, and Mehujael the father of Methushael, and Methushael the father of Lamech.
The second text, Genesis 5, 1 through 32, is much longer, containing the generations between Adam and Noah. Whereas Genesis 4 only listed the names, Genesis 5 lists the names and the ages of the patriarchs when they fathered their first child, the number of years they lived after that. Instead of reading through the whole chapter, here's a list of the names of these fathers, often called the antediluvian or pre-flood patriarchs, with their ages. We see here that the patriarchs lived a long time. Most were well beyond a normal lifespan when they fathered their first child and lived far longer than anyone else in history. We will come back to the question of their ages in a moment, but first I want to focus on the names, because looking at the table above in comparison with the text in Genesis 4 that we just read, we'll see a number of very clear parallels. The table below adds the information from Genesis 4 and shows where the parallels appear. It's pretty obvious looking at the list that the names are very similar. Cain closely parallels Canaan, Enoch and Lamech are identical in the two lists, and Irad, Jared, and Mahulal, and Mahalalel, and Methushael, and Methuselah are essentially the same names, but with just minor phonological changes. In other words, the 7 names found in the Genesis 4 genealogy are entirely encapsulated in the Genesis 5 text. The names are slightly adapted and appear in a different order in a couple of places, but there can be no doubt that there is some connection. But what exactly is the connection? Scholars usually conclude that the similarities here are the result of a long process of reception. The composer of Genesis 5 may very well have known of or used the text of Genesis 4, but there could also be multiple sources in circulation that had constructed the earliest patriarchs in different orders. And there could just be a common source behind these two different ones that get reworked in local variations. Despite having 2 versions of the genealogy, it does seem likely that this reflects an Israelite conception of the beginnings of history. On the surface, this might sound like a mundane observation, but the point is that the lists are extremely similar, despite Genesis 4 having 7 patriarchs before the flood, or 8 if you add Noah, and Genesis 5 having 10, including Noah. The names are almost identical, and it is likely that they reflect different paths of the mythological history as it was being formulated in ancient Israel. We know this wasn't the universal history because we do have other sources to compare it to, namely what has come to us in what is known as the Sumerian King List. The Sumerian King List is basically just what it says it is. It's a text that contains a list of the kings in Sumerian. In Sumerian sources, it is referred to as Nam Lugal, which is the first word of the text and means kingship. The list is very long, but one particular part is very important for us. And this is, of course, the first section, which contains a list of the antediluvian kings. The list can be reconstructed from several different sources and is even different in a couple of the different tablets, which is important here. The oldest tablets are from around 2000 BCE, but most of the witnesses to the text are from the Old Babylonian period, so sometime between 1900 and 1600 BCE. The list is pretty long, but here I'm only really interested in the beginning, so we can look at the entire first part.
After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug. In Eridug, Alulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. 2 kings. They ruled for 64,800 years. Then Eridug fell, and the kingship was taken to Bad Tabira. In Bad Tabira, Enmenlu-Ana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Gal-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid, the shepherd, ruled for 36,000 years. 3 kings. They ruled for 108,000 years. Then Bad Tabira fell, and the kingship was taken to Larug. In Larug, Ensipad-Zid-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. Foreign king, he ruled for 28,800 years. Then Larug fell, and the kingship was taken to Zimbir. In Zimbir, Enmen-Dur-Ana became king. He ruled for 21,000 years. Warn king, he ruled for 21,000 years. Then Zimbir fell, and the kingship was taken to Shurupag. In Shurupag, Ubaratutu became king. He ruled for 18,600 years. Warn king, he ruled for 18,600 years. In 5 cities, 8 kings. They ruled for 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over.
When the list was first discovered, scholars thought that it could be more or less related to a historical reality. Of course, the lengths of their lives must be blown out of proportion, but they thought that maybe the kings reflected a part of history that could be related to or taken from the annals of the kings of Sumeria. More recently, scholars have been more careful, as we have no other real confirmation of the names of these kings or their reigns. There are also a couple of other reasons to be skeptical here. First of all, one of the kings is better known as a god. Dumuzid, spouse of Inanna, and the god of milk and shepherds, is mentioned here as Dumuzid the shepherd. He's even mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, in Ezekiel 8, 14 and 15, where his Hebrew name Tammuz is used. Second, the kings in the king list are described as having ruled many thousands of years. This is obviously problematic from a historical perspective, but is interesting when compared with Genesis. So let's look again at the table from Genesis, this time adding the kings from the Sumerian king list. It is immediately clear that these antediluvian kings and patriarchs lived comparatively long lives. Also, the reigns of the kings span the entire time from creation up until the time of the flood hero. The numbers are clearly different, with the Babylonian being super long. In the majority of the witnesses to the Sumerian king list, there are these 8 kings before the flood. Interestingly, the tablet called WB62, currently held in Oxford at the Ashmolean Museum. This clay tablet only contains the pre-flood part of the Sumerian king list and is slightly different than the other versions. 2 things stand out. 1, it contains 10 kings, and 2, the names are slightly different. Here is an updated table where I've added them as well. So what we see here is that some of the witnesses to the Sumerian king list are closer to the Genesis 4 list, 8 kings before the flood. But WB62 is more similar to Genesis 5, both in the fact that there are 10 kings before the flood, and also in the fact that the final name is literally the flood hero. In Genesis, of course, the hero is Noah, who appears in a series of narratives where he is the star, saving humanity from the flood because God tells him. In the Sumerian king list, Ziusudra is the one who survives the flood. Now, using Ziusudra as being from Shupurok is significant because we meet Ziusudra in the Sumerian flood myth and its retelling in the Gilgamesh epic, where we learn, among other things, that his father was Ubara Tutu. And the Ziusudra tradition is much wider than just the king list. As a final point, I think it's important that the flood actually is mentioned in the text of the Sumerian king list. There is evidence that the section with the antediluvian kings was not originally part of the list, but was added at a later stage. And WB62, that we looked at above, is actually only the pre-flood kings. The time up to the flood is fundamentally different than the post-flood world. People lived longer and are more myth than reality. In Genesis, we have a more narrative style on the whole. So instead of just a list or a genealogy, the story continues. That makes Genesis a very different text. So what we have in the Sumerian king list is a parallel and perhaps even in some ways an inspiration for the inclusion of the antediluvian genealogies in Genesis. But at the same time, the text in Genesis clearly reflects the Israelite construction of history, not the Babylonian one. The Sumerian king list provides an interesting analogy for what happens in the genealogies of Genesis 4 and 5, where we find two variations of the same list. So, while we don't know how directly the Sumerian king list influenced the writings of Genesis, it helps us contextualize the idea of the 8 or 10 great men who existed before the flood and the local variations of the traditions that can lead to variant lists describing the same period of time. So when Genesis 5 reimagines history, it is looking backwards not only at Genesis 4, or whatever text that inspired them both, but it's also using the same common framework of ancient Near Eastern thought about the earliest parts of history that we also find in the Sumerian king list. And in that way, Genesis 5 is a great example of the Bible being written backwards.
You talked about it in your video, all the different similarities, but I think we can go more in detail about that. So I wanted to put this on the screen and just go through the similarities here. Go through the similarities here. There you go. Yeah, okay, that'll work there. All right. So of course the genealogies of, I guess maybe it'd be a good idea to reference the picture one more time. Let's try this. Just a little disorganized. All right. Yeah. So yeah, this is the chart, of course, from your video, and it is on first face value. If you look at this, you might be like, well, I don't really see much similarities at all. Now, of course, you talked in your video about how it's actually a lot more in depth than that. With that being said, I did want to talk about the specific similarities. So, like, between the Sumerian Kings list and the Genesis text, obviously there's long lifespans. Like, really, they lived a long time, and they portray a list of people from creation to the flood. So Adam to Noah, and as well as the Sumerian Kings list, from when kingship began to the flood, and then continuing onwards. And then after the flood, lifetimes get shorter, and then there's really interesting points where some texts of the Sumerian Kings list parallel Genesis really well, and some don't. So, like, for example, WB62 and Genesis 5 both have 10 in the list. Genesis 5 and WB-444 include Enoch and Enmendura as 7th in the list, and both of those have very significant, like, solar similarities, and it's a really interesting coincidence that they would both be seventh in the list and both have the similar background there, as well as the flood legend Noah living 600 years and Ziusudra living 3,600 years. But it's also confusing because this Ziusudra figure is not in WB 444, but is the flood hero in WB 62. So I'm just curious what you think about all of this, how you I don't know, compartmentalize all of this together. Are some of these just significant and some of them just don't mean anything at all? What do you think about all this?
Yeah, well, so that's a really good summary of the similarities, and I think so if we kind of zoom out and look at this, one of the most important things, in my opinion, is this framing around the flood. So it's kind of from the beginning of something up to the flood is this section we're talking about. So that immediately creates a parallel between the genealogies that we find in Genesis, or especially the Genesis 5 genealogy and then the King's List. Now I mean, in my video, I start with the comparing Genesis 5 and Genesis 4, because I think that's actually a helpful thing to show us that what we're dealing with when we're talking about similarities between the King's List and the genealogies, that they're not like these identical, super close philological or phonological similarities like we find between Genesis 4 and 5. And so there's here, it is definitely a step away, but it's still similar. And by looking at it as this explanation of the great men who are around for each generation between the beginning of something, so the beginning of the kingship or the beginning of whatever creation, that we have a specific number of generations that is very limited and that share these similar attributes of being expressed in very large numbers compared to what everyone else in the texts that follow are. And then having that with the flood being that demarcation between the ancient past, where these long lives or these big numbers are found, and the more recent past, I guess, or more attainable past, where things are expressed in more humanly numbers. So, Mike, from that kind of telescoped out view of it, I think that's actually a pretty important parallel, that we're looking at how do we express the movement of time in relation to people, the generations of people from creation or from the beginning up until the time of the flood. So in that case, I think we have a very similar thing, because that we do, like you said, we do have 10 in some versions. We have 10 heroes or 10 kings in Genesis 5, and then one of the documents, one of the copies or versions of the Sumerian King's List. But obviously, we do have different numbers in some of the other tablets. But that's why it's also important to remember that Genesis chapter 4 does have a genealogy that actually might kind of show that there's a tradition of fewer kings or fewer people between Adam and the flood than 10. And so I think we probably don't need to get hung up on any of those differences, but just look at that similarity, that we're talking 8 or 10 people from creation up into the time of the flood. So 8 or 10 generations. And that's, in one way, you would say, well, that's not a lot of generations. Like that, it sure didn't take them long to mess things up that badly. But then when you see these massive lifespans, then you think, oh, well, I guess they had plenty of time to mess things up. So it's a kind of a strange combination, I guess, like of that. In one way, you're thinking, man, why does it go so quickly towards having to be recreated or whatever? But at the same time, these numbers of these grand lifespans really are similar. Now, the other thing I think is just interesting here is that we have we have this flood figure that does get named in some of the copies, right? And so what this says to me is that we have something that's talking to the outside literary world So then it's not just a text that is self-contained or is just like a list of names that randomly try and explain how we got from point A to point B, but it's connecting it to that literary universe where people are already oriented. And so when Ziusudra is named within the flood myth, this is the name that's used in the Sumerian flood myth. So this is well established, and Ziusudra is also the name that's used in the Gilgamesh version. So it's a little more complicated than that, but basically it's pretty obvious that the name Utnapishtim that's used in the Gilgamesh epic is just an Akkadian play on the symbols that are Ziusudra in the cuneiform. And so when we look at the cuneiform, we can see that Ziusudra is still the name of the hero, and so we have kind of a communication between texts. So what, like, some people like the word intertextuality. I don't really like that word because it gets used and abused in different ways by scholars sometimes. But we have this figure, the flood figure, showing up in other texts that aren't necessarily just a list of kings, and I think that's kind of important. And we see the same thing with only one or two of the other kings, right? That do show up, and those are the ones immediately preceding Ziusudra, because Ziusudra is in the well, it depends on which list you're looking at, but the kings that are just prior to the flood are Ubaratutu, who is the father of Ziusudra in the Gilgamesh epic. So we know that name already from several other places. And then we also have Shuruppak is named, and that's named the city, but this is also in some of the tablets, it's the name of a king, right? And so we have kind of this uncertainty, and that's also a name that shows up in a number of other texts. So it's connections to the outside literary world, which we also find in the biblical account, right? And so that's kind of the point with all that rambling, was that when we find these characters, they're put into ancient history in this way. We do find other literary traditions that connect to them in other places. And so, like with the Noah story, I mean, obviously Noah gets immediately brought into the story in Genesis because the genealogy has been separated. When you look at the continuation of this genealogy, so Zach, where do we find that after the continuation of the Genesis 5 genealogy happens later?
What are you talking about? Are you asking for a chapter?
Yeah, I'm testing you.
What are you asking again?
Yeah. So the genealogy continues, right? So it continues on in Genesis 11 is the real real continuation of it, and we have kind of a true line from Adam until Abraham, which is the major genealogy that we're looking at. But we also get the genealogies for the sons of Abraham, or Isaac, or Jacob, I guess would be later on. Yeah. But what we're looking at in Genesis is a text that's framed by the genealogy. And so these external sources, these other ideas, these other literary snippets are brought in between the genealogy. Or looking at it differently, the genealogy is there framing the text in a different way. But the characters are there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Okay. Did you have any other thoughts you wanted to add before we keep going?
Oh, I don't even remember what I'm supposed to be talking about, so
that's okay. Good. That's great. Awesome. All right. So I did want to talk about just a little bit more there. So I think there is a confusing aspect to this where we have so many different texts, and it's like, well, if you compare WB62 in Genesis 5, it's like, what is there, a few similarities. Or if you compare WB444 and Genesis 5, and it's like there's still a few similarities, but if you combine them all together, it's like there's more similarities, but like, should you combine them all together? Like, it's not like the Genesis text was like looking at all these ones at once It's like, are we making similarities, or what do you think about that? I mean, you kind of touched on it, but I mean, it seems like some people might say, hey, we're making too much out of these similarities that aren't really there. What do you think?
Uh, so I mean, I don't think we're making too much out of them, because I don't think I'm making very much out of it, actually.
Okay.
My thinking on this is not that one of the cuneiform tablets that we have was the literal literary source to the Book of Genesis. So in that case, I'm not making anything out of it. But what I do think is that there are so many clear parallels in the way of thinking, in the way of
Mm,
imagining the earliest history here, that it seems very likely that the Hebrew way of thinking about this is influenced by the Sumerian or the Mesopotamian way of thinking about this.
mm,
And this is not surprising, because when you look at the sources, the Sumerian texts are different. When we find later Babylonian and Assyrian versions of it, they're different. And so what we see is that there's more likely local versions of a similar conception of ancient history that are coming to expression in these different texts, than that they are one specific thing that has been copied,
yeah.
attempted to be copied perfectly and then just translated. So each version of it seems to be adapting to making history a little bit more their own, depending on who they is.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. In one way, I see that it's like, okay, there are some differences here, and we can't just pick and choose what text we want to look at. At the same time, um, like for example, with Genesis 5 and WB 444, which include Enoch and Enmindarana being seventh on the list. So like maybe it's a coincidence. It seems like it's not that they're like copying or something, but um, I guess it's possible that maybe they had um, the Israelites had in mind, or had the same conceptual way of thinking, or maybe even knew of a very similar text that they were basing this off of. But I guess the Sumerian King's list that we have today, the different versions, they were just we don't have that specific one that they had. What do you think about that idea, or do you think just more conceptual?
I mean, so I don't think of conceptual as being free from material basis. So I would say that there would have to have been something that communicated these things, but
Yeah.
it could be through oral communication, or it could be through a written text. But then those oral communications were probably put down in text in certain ways. So I do think that when we find those examples where we have like the seventh in the list thing with Enmendarana, then I think that's interesting. I think that's likely there was a seventh person on the list that was related to something related to this, the sun and the explanation of the luminaries and those kind of things.
Mm,
Though again, we have to be careful with that one, because I don't feel like that's completely decided that the ancient Israelites were aware of this, of the Enmendarana tradition, but it's
mm,
it's possible, and it is interesting as scholars when we're looking back. We say, oh well, those two guys are so similar, and it's probably the same guy. It makes you wonder, like, how else it would have ended up on the same place in the list of people between the beginning and the flood,
yeah.
or in the same number of generations before the flood, or whatever. So I think that's there. And again, like, for me, the whole idea of creation to flood, or the beginning of something to the flood, as being the framework of the time that is different from everything else, right? And even the terminology that's used for the spans of the reigns of the kings in the king list is different for this section than it is for the later section. So it's obviously its own special thing. And I think that's like pretty clear in Genesis as well, that we're dealing with a different kind of literature when we're dealing with before the flood,
Mm,
or and honestly up to the time of Abraham. But the comparison becomes much clearer when you literally have that explanation, that and then the flood came, that makes it so we're not just dealing with something that was, hey, find random 8 or 10 guys in history and let's see if we can compare them in some way. But it's like the time frame fits, and then it's like, how do we explain the ancient past, the most ancient past of what we care about? And when it comes then in a very similar form, then I start to think probably somebody knew something. But again, like you said, I don't know if it was a text. It seems not to be one of the texts that we know, but there's very, very, very likely other versions of this that we haven't found or that we will never find. And so it would be a historical anomaly if we would really find the exact one that gave us the smoking gun connection.
Yeah, for sure. There was one specifically that maybe stood out just a little bit more, and this was WB444. So it explicitly has the seventh in it, and um, and it also mentions a flood. And why that's important is even though Ziusudra is not named in it, it's like, well, everybody knows Ziusudra is going to be in it, right?
Right.
I guess that's the idea. And um, but of course, even in this situation, there's not 10.
Right.
There's still only 8.
Yep.
Now that it's like what to make of that. Is it just the changing of I guess it's really easy just to for someone to take a name off the list or skip a generation or add one. I mean, it's really easy for the Genesis writer to throw in an extra name if they wanted to. Assuming this isn't some strict some attempt at some strictly historical account, or maybe they thought it was historical and like it wasn't, or something like that.
Well, and I mean, again, this is important when we're looking at the connections between Genesis 4 and Genesis 5, because I think that there probably is some sort of a weaving together of traditions there that's happening. And so when we see that Cain, I mean, the Genesis 4 is the generations of Cain, and Cain shows up as Canaan in the Genesis 5 account. And so there is a very, I think there's a really good chance that WB444 comparison that you showed, if you just remove Canaan from that list, then and then you assume that Ziusudra is there with Noah, then there's no real problems. Except for that Enoch is no longer the seventh, so then we lose that. But it's I don't know. There's an interesting multi-level, multi-source thing going on here. I think when the Genesis genealogy is being developed, it's not just something that was put together only based on Sumerian influence or Mesopotamian influence. It's not only based on a retelling of Genesis 4, but there is some significant composition going on here.
Yeah, so you do think that somewhere along the lines, Genesis 5 is a later text than Genesis 4?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been the common way of looking at it. I know there are people that think that the Genesis 4 comes later, but it's a pretty common way of reading it, that we have the earlier Genesis 4 account that is adapted into the Genesis 5, where the I guess the priestly source is the way of thinking about it, that kind of is making this this more congruent genealogy going from Adam all the way up to or down to Abraham.
Yeah, I do think it's just extremely fascinating that Genesis 4 and Genesis 5, they have such similar names. It's like it's like what? My favorite one and this type of thing is like there's I think it was Irenaeus that he made a list of like I don't know, like bishops or something like that, from like Peter and Paul all the way up to his time, and like the sixth guy on the name was named Sixtus.
Yeah,
it's like
nice.
Okay, alrighty, what's going on here?
Yeah, somebody missed a name.
Um, but I do want to ask you, Noah at the end here. So I can see how someone might be saying, okay, well, you're fudging the chart a little bit here by throwing in Noah in Genesis 4, because Noah is not mentioned in Genesis 4. Am I right?
That's
So,
right.
like, what's the logic here to think that something that we should put in there as like almost like a similarity?
Well, it's just simply that if you look at the Genesis 5 account as moving on to a parallel account, so
Yeah.
you Genesis 4, we're in the account of the line of Cain, and then Genesis 5 kind of goes back and says this is the line of Adam through Seth, and retells everything, and then we go back to the back to the main line of the story in Genesis 6, and that's where Noah shows up. And so, like in the traditional source criticism way of dividing things up, you would call 4 would be in the J source, the Yahweh source, and 5 is in the priestly source, P. And so when you cut out the P part, you still have returning to Noah right after this. So it's not separated from Noah in the I guess earlier form or whatever. So we do think that this genealogy at one point continued straight into the flood.
Interesting. Interesting. That's fascinating. Okay. I did want to mention one other thing about the similarities is that in the numbers, the Sumerian kings list, at least the pre-Diluvian kings, are very clearly like symbolic, at least in some of them. So I can't think of off the top of my head, but like very very and like some of the lifespans, if you want to call it that, are the same. It's like what are the chances of that? That's almost impossible. But and then you also see in Genesis where Lamech is 777. Then you have Enoch 365.
Yep.
Noah is he didn't live he lived apparently 950 years, but as at the flood it was 500, and then what was it? When did 600 come along? Is that like no? I can't remember.
It's like 500 when he gets told, and then
Okay.
something I don't
600
remember.
when it was a flood, whatever.
Yeah, something like
but
that.
yeah, like that's a really interesting, just firm like 500, 600. That it almost seems symbolic in some way. Now, maybe we're making out of nothing, but it does seem like there could be something going on here. Not that it was copied, but a similar way of writing, maybe. Do you have any thoughts to add on that?
Well, I mean, I think the use of symbolic numbers is something that was just widespread in the ancient Near East. So there's no surprise that the numbers would have symbolic value. We also know that the Sumerian number system was based on 60 and not on 10. And so there would have been like these numbers that show up make more sense, or most of them make more sense in a base 60 counting system than they do, in a base 10. So like 36,000 years as a number is a pretty reasonable thing, because it's 600 times 60, right? And so it would be is that right? I don't know. I'm not a great mathematician, but I think that makes sense to my head. But what you end up with is kind of a similar a way of exaggerating that connects them. And you see that again, like in the Sumerian Kings list, this gets corrected immediately after the flood. So there's that change that I think is the most interesting, that when you have these kind of giant symbolic numbers, they have one level of meaning that might be like, okay, maybe they do mean something. When you see 36,000, it's probably a perfect number, right? It's 600 times 60 is an amazing number, but the numbers like Enoch's 365, and he's the one that does like the heavenly bodies, and the sun calendar gets connected to him in later times. It's an amazingly symbolic number, but these grand numbers also are symbolic in themselves. And so that's what kind of makes it important, is that we have several layers of value to the numbers that are being given.
Mm, Yeah, that's fascinating. Something else I wanted to add there was so this is it's Sumerian King list. Yeah, so as mentioned before, um, yeah, symbolic numbers like 108,000, and but one specifically was it adds up the ages at the end.
Hmm.
Now, young Earth creationists love to say, hey, we should add all the ages of Genesis. And I do find that really interesting because the Sumerian Kings list actually does add them up. Um, do you have any thoughts on if that is maybe what the Genesis text is doing? Or um, I, I imagine that there is a not a symbolic but a literary element to why they would have added up, to say, hey, like this is some really long time, right? Or what do you think about that?
I mean, I think anytime you have numbers, people are going to want to add them up. So I think it's in the nature of numbers, basically. So I don't think there's like a big, like, I don't know, not a big conspiracy or a big parallel in that. What's interesting is that they don't actually add them up
Yeah.
in Genesis, right? So there's not um, like the driving force in the Genesis genealogy is not the number of years that have passed, but it's the narrative itself. And so that's where we see that this is a different thing. Like,
Mm,
and like the genealogy is still a genealogy. It's still a list that's formulated in a specific way that is very comparable to the chronologies and chronicles that we find elsewhere in the ancient world, but it is placed within a narrative framework, and so it doesn't serve the same kind of function. Now, chroniclers later will do that, right? Like, so when you get to Eusebius and you get to other early Christian chroniclers, they want to tell you the total numbers of things, and so they'll add up this kind of stuff. And that also, like, so this kind of comparison, like what we're doing right now, has actually been happening for like almost 2,000 years, because the ancient the church fathers, the first interpreters, Christian interpreters of the Bible, they knew that the Hebrew version was different than the Greek in the
numbers.
text of Genesis and the numbers, right? And so they wanted to know what's going on, and so they did this. They would put this side by side and say, well, in the Hebrew or the Masoretic text, we call now the Masoretic text, I guess in the Hebrew version, it's that way, but in the Septuagint, in the Greek version, it looks like that. And then when we look at the Syriac, it might be a little different. And then we look at the Book of Jubilees, has even different numbers. And so, like, they knew that there were different numbers for these calculations going on, and they were
Mm,
comparing them. And so there was a genuine question of how long was the period before the flood, and how long did these things last? And I think that's like, so it's a very valid question to be asking. Does it have any significance? Like,
mm,
is there a reason for having this many years? And I'm not sure there is, but there might be significance in the number of generations. Like in the there's more, it's more interesting how many generations it takes to Abraham, and then from Abraham to David, or something like that. Like, that might be a more central part of the construction of the Pentateuch.
yeah. Yeah. So I did want to clarify something. So in your video, you put this on the screen here, and Um, I guess maybe someone might get the idea like, hey, you're comparing, one, two, three, four, five, six, seven, or, supposedly eight generations in the Genesis 4 text, and comparing that with eight in one of the versions of the Sumerian Kings list. So you're not saying like, hey, one is like copied from one version of the Sumerian Kings list, and another one is copied from the other, right? You're Could you explain the relation one more time?
Yeah.
So is it the idea that like Genesis 4 and Genesis 5 are their own branches, as well as WB62 and whatever this other King's list is? That's
Yeah.
just another branch of the Sumerian King's list. Is that it?
Yeah. So what I'm trying to get at here is what I said before, that these are probably all local variations that have different connections to each other. So when you look at the different manuscripts of the King's List, they have different numbers. Some of them have different names. And what we find is a tendency to have 8 in the majority of them, right? But even those aren't always clear. And a lot of the manuscripts we're reconstructing to figure out like where, who exactly is there and whatnot. And then we have some traditions that are 10, like we have in WB 62 there. And so my point is that what we have are different local variations, different ways of expressing this line of kings or great men from creation to the flood. And the same thing comes to expression in the genealogies of Genesis 4 and 5. If we accept that they basically reflect a similar understanding of the ancient past, but Genesis 4 tells it from the perspective of Cain, where Genesis 5 is telling the perspective of Seth. And they're using basically the same structure, the same template, but they're filling it slightly differently. And in the Genesis 5, you needed 10 slots to get there. Like that's just the way it was. Whereas in Genesis 4, you didn't. And so they're not, it doesn't mean that one is using one copy of the King's List and the other is using a different copy of the King's List, but that they're both impacted by this way of thinking of history. And they're then influenced in different ways and being composed in different ways. And again, like I've never said that they're being copied directly from the King's List. I think I actually end up saying the opposite is what my point is, that it's not a copy. And I thought it was interesting that the guy you had on your channel, I forget his name.
Gabriel Costa.
Yeah, who is like an expert on the King's List, but I would say probably not on Genesis.
Yeah,
He was
said
pretty
himself.
he was very clear that that he thought there was influence, right? And so I was actually really interested to hear how clear he was about thinking that there was influence from the King's List on the Genesis text. That at least that's how I interpreted what he said. Is that what you felt he said?
I can't remember. When we talked, he was very like, yeah, I'm not too sure about that. So like, yeah, he maybe said they was influence, but at the same time, what he meant by that is a good question. Because like when I asked him about in Mindirana, he's like, well, if he is in the text as the number 7th, and then I think I mentioned Yasudra, and he's like, well, like if it is in the text, then like which like it's a fair point. Like there are only specific traditions that have these figures that seem to parallel, and they're not all the same tradition. So like he was questioning that, but at the same time, like yeah. I mean, I guess wouldn't you say that anybody would say that there is some influence?
Well, that's what I don't know. I mean, that's why I do these kind of things, is because I think they're interesting and I think it's worth talking about. But I don't think everybody accepts it like that.
Interesting.
Because I do think some people would just say this is the truth, or this is the way it was, and so it's just reflecting actual history or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where I think it's interesting to talk about which things we actually what we actually base these discussions on. And so like I'm not basing my discussion on the names. There was an attempt, there's an article from like 53 or something like that, where somebody claims that the names are identical, right? It's just the Akkadian version, and then you translate it to Hebrew, and then it all fits. And it doesn't. Like that's been proven wrong, I think, pretty clearly. So it's not a copy of any king list that we know.
Yeah.
But again, like I don't think that anything ever was just in the air. Like that it was just like randomly people in Mesopotamia are writing their histories like this, and then people in Israel writing their histories like this. There is a broader tradition that the Israelites were exposed to, because the Sumerian tradition is older, and we know that tradition gets passed down to the Babylonians and to the Assyrians, and so it's not a surprise. Like it's not strange that it's happening, but the Israelites are structuring their thinking about ancient history in a very similar way to what we see expressed in the Sumerian King's List. And that's all I mean. And what I think is then more interesting in this case than in some of the other stuff we talk about is the fact that we have two different genealogies in Genesis, and we have multiple king lists where we see we see the similarities, but we also see those minor variations. And that together makes it an even more interesting case because it
Yeah.
shows us that when things get borrowed or used or recycled or rewritten or whatever, like they can take different forms, and that this can happen internally within a culture or externally to a new culture and language.
Yeah, yeah, I could see how maybe a conservative would push back on the whole Genesis 4, Genesis 5 comparison, because it's like, well, a number of different scholars have responded to that. But I think it's worth mentioning that there are multiple ways that these names could have come about. Like if you think of the name Adam, like, okay, one, Hebrew didn't exist at the time. Adam clearly has some type of symbolic meaning. Like that name was not if it was an original person, that was not the original name. And for a number of like people, a lot of these names have very symbolic meaning in the text, like Noah resting, and um, it was Abel is like what is that? It's like it means like your life is fleeting or whatever.
Mhm.
Like it's like, oh, what a coincidence! He died like immediately in the story. Oh wow.
Yeah.
Um, s- so um, so in other words, like even if they are extremely similar names and maybe they are influencing each other, it doesn't mean that like that we should just wholly reject that just because like we think the only other option is to say that they were copying each other, right?
Well, I mean, so I guess that's where like my way of thinking is just like I don't care if they copied each other either. Like I don't know what the problem is. Like it depends on what you're trying to make this text into, I guess.
Mm,
And from my perspective, like it's a piece of literature, and it's interesting that there were that there are sometimes borrowings that are clear. There's sometimes things that almost seem to be taken verbatim from one text to another. But then other cases like this, it's more fuzzy because those linguistic parallels aren't necessarily there in the same way. And so
mm,
then you have to look at it and say, well, what is this thing, and how did it become like it is?
mm,
And my reading of it is just that you don't throw away similarities because there are differences, right?
mm,
And that's the point, because like, and as you say, like, yeah, sure, you can explain away the similarities between Genesis 4 and 5, but at the end of the day, you have like back-to-back genealogies from the exact same time period where they're given names that are almost identical, and that's very interesting, and we can explain it in different ways. And I don't think we have to like say, well, if it wasn't copied perfectly, then there was no connection, because that's like, I think that's also bad logic, right? Because that's generally the argument you hear is, well, hey, look, the order is slightly different and the names aren't identical, so therefore it's not copied. And like, well, no, nobody said it was copied. It was reworked.
mm.
And that makes it different. And so like that's I don't like these like polarizations of things where you say that it has to be a certain way if it would have happened in the past at all, and again, it's the exact same thing with the king list. Like we have different conceptions. They have different names and different thinking on the lifespans, and they have different important things to bring out. It's important, obviously the Enoch tradition is being presented in a different way, and it's important in the story, and that's one of the most important patriarchs in the story because he gets his own like mention, that he does stuff, and I think that's just part of the development within the Hebrew tradition. That's just what it is.
Yeah, thank you. So you mentioned the differences, so let's go ahead and get into them. So this is I guess a long list of reasons. This is one writer that I pulled this from a scholarly article. I don't even remember the name, sadly. But either way, maybe I could put it in the description later. I guess there is some almost an apologetic attempt maybe not from this guy, but from others to say like, hey, there are all these differences, and I think they are worth mentioning. So, so for example, the major, well, before we get into that, actually, of course, a lot of people will be like, okay, so Genesis 5 has 10 people on the list. Genesis 11 has 10 people on the list. And then, oh, wow, look at that. The Sumerian Kings list, a lot of the versions have 10. So it's like, okay, that's a big similarity. And then, so it's like someone like this writer would say, the major recension of the Sumerian Kings list, W444, contains only 8 and not 10 kings. One text contains only 7 kings, and another, UCBC 91819, either 7 or 8, whereas a bilingual fragment from Ashurbanipal's library has but 9 kings, Berosus, and only one ancient tablet, WB62, only 2 texts, of which only one is a cuneiform document, give a total of 10 antediluvian kings. So there is some similarities, but also there's so many texts that have differences. So it's like, is that just a coincidence? Are we cherry picking the text? You commented on earlier. I am interested to hear your thoughts though on how, like, maybe the symbolic nature of the number 10, if that's a good way to put it, because it does seem interesting that Genesis 5 and 11 seem to have 10 in their list. And then interesting that other texts from outside the Bible also have 10. Now, it's worth noting, sure, that some of these others don't have 10, but what do you make of that? Like, do you think there's any chance that the Genesis writer was using 10 on purpose?
Well, I think as the text is now, that yes, Genesis 5 and Genesis 11 are based on a 10-generation template that is kind of dividing up history into 2 epochs, or whatever we want to call it, 2 eras, one up to the flood, and then from the flood to Abraham. So I think that's I think that's pretty standard way of looking at the division of it, of the book of Genesis, or the first part of the book of Genesis. So I don't think there's anything really like controversial in saying that. The only controversy would be about whether or not you think that that's like reflects true history, or whether it was a compositional technique. And I would say it's probably a compositional technique. That's how I would read the text, that it was kind of split up, 10 there and 10 there. And then that's why it is interesting that it reflects the, some copies of the king list. And again, this is something we haven't gotten into, and what I didn't get into really in the video, and I don't know if I want to get into, but I'll say it anyway. It's just the fact that there's a lot here at stake, depending on where and how you date the writing of the biblical texts. So I would consider Genesis 5 something that's probably post-exilic. So we're into the Persian period. Maybe later. I'm not exactly sure when this happens, but I would think at least post-exilic, right? And Berosus is a Greek historian who is working in the post-exilic time. He has a source from Babylon, and we have to. So this is kind of where it gets a little foggy. We don't know exactly where Berosus gets his source, but the story about Berosus is that he travels to Babylon and he talks with Babylonian priests, and he gets this information in that way. And so Berosus would have has somehow gained access to this information in Mesopotamia in that period. And so it's not like we're having to postulate a connection to the oldest version of the Sumerian Kings list. But it seems that Berosus had access to a king list that was 10 kings in the post-exilic period. And that was found in Babylon. That's where he had probably made that connection. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that the period at which the Israelites would have had their possible connection with Babylon, that is the same time when we find most likely a source that has these 10 generations or 10 kings. So I think it's worth dwelling on that number, like you've done there, because it seems to be a later form, and a form that at least is known up until the time when contact would have been most likely for the writing of the Genesis 5 text.
Yeah, it is really interesting that, of course, the Berosus text is in Greek, right? So I guess I don't know how much that plays into this conversation. It just shows that there's differing versions, but I don't know. Like, it's obviously you don't. Well, you wouldn't say that the Genesis writer is looking at the Greek version, right? You're looking at maybe they have in mind or think the same way, or maybe even know of a text that's some very similar to Berosus's version. Is that what you're saying?
Well, yeah. I mean, what I'm saying is that the version that Berosus finds in what, the third century or something. I mean, yeah. So it's, I think, third century BC. And if he is accessing a text in that time, which is a 10-person list, that means there must have been one in existence at that time. And so I'm not saying that the Israelite or Judite author is using Berosus's text or a Greek text, but that there must have been one in existence at that time that could be accessed. And so if that was something that's accessed, which it is because we have the result here, then it would have been possible for the Israelites also to be exposed to that 10 generation way of thinking. So I'm not saying it's dependent on Greek text. I mean, there are people out there that would say that Genesis is hugely influenced by Berosus. I think I'm a little too traditional to go that far just yet, but I do think it's worth thinking about that some of these things are structured in similar ways to some Greek texts that we do have.
Yeah.
And I mean, and when we look at the table of nations in Genesis 10, again, another genealogy, there are a lot of elements there that also are pretty Hellenistic. And so it does seem like there's possibilities that some of these things are being written all the way into the Hellenistic period, which means that they could be using Greek sources. But again, that's like, I don't have enough information to say what Genesis 5 is using. And that's kind of my point here. I think that what we see is the rewriting, the readapting of traditions that were known, and the product is a very Hebrew genealogy. And that 10 is something we see repeatedly, and obviously not just in genealogies, because it also shows up like in the commandments and in other places that 10 does function as an important number.
Right. Yeah. All right. So more on that, you have different languages between the texts. So the Sumerian King's List, so you have Greek, Sumerian, and Akkadian, right? And all the different texts that we have. So it's different, but it's like, how important is that really?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't understand that that's I don't know. I mean, duh. Like it's obvious that they're in different languages, but we know that people knew multiple languages, and people could receive traditions from other languages and cultures into new contexts. So, at least from my perspective, I don't know what this is actually arguing for or against what you've put up on the screen, but I would say different languages is just a statement of fact. Like Sumerian is not the same as Akkadian, which is not the same as Greek, which is not the same as Hebrew.
Yeah, well, I think the writer or whoever makes these types of claims are basically saying, hey, like, this is just completely different text. Like, you're just pointing out some vague similarities, but it's so much different. But let's keep going. So, different years of reign. So, like, yeah, clearly that means it's not copied, right? There's clearly different years of reigns.
Yeah.
Then you have the Sumerian King's List as a succession of king's pattern. And CN, RNI ruled X years, RN ruled X years, RN ruled X years, X kings ruled Y years. Antediluvian section concludes these are X 5 cities, X 8 kings ruled this many years. Then the flood swept over. So like it's a very, very, very different pattern from the Genesis text. And of course, the ideology and purpose of it is very different, where it's a widely accepted political idea which cherished the concept of long continued unification of the land. The Sumerian Kings list is a political tract designed to perpetuate the perfectly transparent fiction of that Sumer and Akkad had, since the flood, been united under the rule of a single king, albeit that king might come at any given time from any one of 11 different cities. So like it's just a completely different text, Dr. Monger. How dare you say that there's so many similarities when it's just a different text?
Yeah, but I dare because it's like I agree. Like it's obvious they're different texts. That's literally the whole point. Like they are different texts, but the conception of history is very, very similar in them. And that's what's interesting. Like we're not discussing we're not discussing the flood myths. Like someday we can do that. We'll sit down and we can do that. And then people can say, how dare you? But I'm sorry, there's so many linguistic parallels there that you have a hard time avoiding the relationship. But in this case, like, how dare I? Like, how dare I say that time before the flood being structured in this small number of generations of great men who lived a really long time is similar. Like, there's no reason why they have to structure history that way. There's obviously no reason we have to have a flood at all. Like it's just really interesting that things are similar, and that's all I really care about. Like I'm not trying to make grand claims about copying or forging or anything like that. And I mean, and by the way, I hate that word. I hate when people think that copying means forging or adapting means something ill conceived or whatever. Like it's just, I think that these ways of expressing the past are similar. And that is an important thing to be thinking about when we think about these texts and how they originated and how they came to be that way. Because I agree, or I mean, I don't think anyone's disagreeing with me when I say that this is a very Hebrew genealogy, and it fits where it is for a specific reason, and it fits there very well. So it's not a mistake that Genesis 5 is like it is, and it's not trying to trick anyone. But at the same time, like it fits into the pattern of the way of conceiving the very beginnings of history that we find elsewhere, and that's why I talked about it.
Yeah. So there is the historical question here. So I don't know of any. It's pretty much agreed by literally everybody in the world that's a scholar on this topic that the Sumerian Kings list, that this first section is describing something that's like just not true, right? In regards to like there was no unification, it was very split up. Like that's not a historical, that's just wrong, okay? So then there's the question of like, is the writers of these texts just framing it that way to give an ideological point? Did they actually think that? There's that, which is interesting. I'm just curious. I mean, what do you think about the historical question in regards to, I guess, what these writers are attempting to portray? Do you think they're attempting to portray something that historically happened, like these people actually lived this long? I guess there's a big question of like, did they actually think that they lived that long, or is part of it symbolic, part of it not? Are they just making up names? What do you think about all that in the Sumerian Kings list as well as Genesis?
Well, I think things develop over much longer time and in much more complicated ways than that we could just say they made it up. So I don't think they made it up in the way we think of somebody sitting down to write fiction and just like says, once upon a time, there was a troll under a bridge or whatever. And like, sorry, I'm in Norway. That's what we have is trolls under bridges. Right. But the thing is that I do think that texts often reflect a process by which they develop to serve a certain purpose. And in this case, the most widely accepted idea is that this unification, this idea that there's one king, would serve then the interests of someone who claims to be the legitimate king, and that there should only be one of me. and that's a very specific function, right? That's a very important political statement, that there is this one unified king, and that the king here is the king over, the whole land, and that this was established as an order of creation or whatever. And I think that, like, that seems to be a good motivation to say, yeah, there were kings there, and there's some kings there, and there's some kings there, but they came at different times, and the kingship moved between them. And that's where this very beginning part, right, is really interesting, because the antediluvian thing says that, in the beginning, kingship came down from heaven, and it was there, and it was there, and then it moved to there, and then it moved to there, and then moved to there. And this is like establishing this chronological diversity. So it happens there, but it's never in the same place twice or at the same time. And that, in a way, like, is probably the biggest clue that it's not historical, because there were most likely rulers in each of these cities at the same time, and there's nothing that shows us that this was a unified kingdom. And so possibly these were names that were known already. So some of them were probably known, like we talked about earlier. Some of these names show up in other texts in the literary world, and so we know that some of the kings would have been known. But it doesn't mean they were historical figures, but it means at least their names were known, and they are placed here to serve that function. As, oh, that was when he was king there. Oh, okay, that's great. And so we end up with kind of a construction of something that may reflect things that people would have understood and thought that might be true, and then it weaves it into something that serves a completely different function. And again, as we look backwards at history, the further away things are, the harder it is to imagine how things were then. And I don't think that has changed now. I think we still do that. We tend to think, like, the most recent history we kind of imagine as ourselves, and then we get to a point where things are so different that we don't even understand it anymore. And then, like, then things could have been very, very different back then, and we just don't know. So I don't think it's strange that people wrote history in that way. In our modern thinking, like, we would use the words propaganda or fictions or something like that. But I think it's more complicated than that, because I think it's just like it's something in between, thinking that this has to be true in the sense that we place true as either it happened exactly in that way, or it's a lie. But it's that we can have different ways of imagining the past or imagining things, and that those don't have to have been, like, perfectly exactly what happened in the real world, but they can still be valid as ways of telling our story. And that's where I think, like, we don't ever do well when we have discussions about truth or historicity in these things, because even if we, like, are able to prove it's not historical in that way, it doesn't mean that people didn't think that it was valid or good. And so that, I do think there were people that thought this was a valid way of explaining the past. And I'm pretty sure that once it was, communicated to people as an authority, as an authoritative way of thinking about the past, that other people would have thought that actually happened in that way. And so whether the authors conceived of it as such, it's hard to say, but I'm sure that people literally thought it was that way, because that is what we see with the Genesis text. Like, there are people that think that, like, the patriarchs lived that long, and that these were the only generations between Adam and Noah. And that's, again, like, I think that the genealogies serve as a very specific function in the text of Genesis. It's not just to tell us what happened in history, but it's to make the story complete. It's a story that goes from Adam to Abraham, and then from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob, to the sons of Jacob, to Moses, and onward, right? So we have a kind of this narrative throughout the Old Testament that you lose a lot if you start just removing the genealogies and only saying that they are the natural historical description of things. No, they're bridging the stories and making a very clear connection from the beginning all the way down to Noah, from Noah to Abraham, and then afterward we see this, that they connect the different stories on down. So I think that initially, like originally, I don't know if the authors thought they were true. Like that, I think, is a question that is very difficult for us to know. But I do think that they thought of them as valid as ways of telling the story.
That's really fascinating. So just for clarity, so you mentioned how you have Adam to these genealogies to Abraham, which there's some purpose behind it. I would assume it's not just, hey, we got to put some names in the middle to connect the dots, right? Like there's some literary purpose to a lot of these genealogies. But if you could explain maybe more succinctly there, what do you think is the purpose of these genealogies? Like, what was the text conveying by including these genealogies in there?
Well, it does a number of things, right? One thing is it is connecting like this symbolism, I think, because we know intuitively that there needs to be a time gap between certain episodes, and so compositionally, we need something between Adam and Eve, or Cain and Abel, and the flood, because the flood story starts with there's lots of people and they're making noise or whatever. We've got this problem. There's all these people and there's the sons of God, and then we need people. And so you can't just go from Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel to lots of people, right? Otherwise, the flood story makes no sense. So you have to, there's compositionally that you need something, narratively, you need something. And that time in this case is partially filled by, or is filled by genealogy. But at the same time, like, remember that we get certain things in that story. So it's used to tell us little bits of information, right? So we learn, and I'm just going to look at the text on my other screen just so you know I'm not like randomly clicking here. So you have, obviously the Enoch story is the one that has the most, right? Because Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him, right? And this is the kind of thing that gets developed later on in history. But we see that that when we count, right, or when we get to, sorry, my linguistic functions are failing me at the moment. Give me one sec. I will reboot. I don't know where we'll cut that, but you'll find a place. But so
okay.
Anyway,
they know English isn't your first language. No, I'm just kidding.
It is, but it's that's so embarrassing. But anyway, like, so the thing we see is that these we build up narratively in this first genealogy to getting to the flood. And it makes sense. It connects the generations. And again, like, I still think there's a connection to Genesis 4, that it's taking these two different ways of looking at the genealogies, and it gets them both to the time of the flood. But the Genesis 11 one is what really is interesting, because when you get to Genesis 11, we do find some stuff that that kind of is symbolic by the names of the people. We have Peleg or Phaleg, right? Who is the I don't know. I can't count that high. But he's the patriarch that comes halfway down, right? And he's like, it's there. Thank you. Yeah. So we get a couple. Well, let's start. So Peleg lives there, right? And he's and Peleg means to separate, or to be separated, or something like that. And that's something that then gets used in the Book of Jubilees as a sign of, this is where things went south. Like they split, the good line and the bad line split. And after this, the patriarchs start marrying women from outside the line of the straight line kind of descendants, and things go wrong. Aber is connected to the Hebrews, so the word Hebrew is connected to that, and we see that becomes like an important line of developing who the Hebrews are. Yeah, we have here a way of moving the story onward, and again, without trying to bring in Jubilees too much into this, what happens in the Book of Jubilees is that these names and these people get connected to a movement to Mesopotamia, and kind of making sure that the story is situated there, which is where Abraham is born, right? And so the genealogy serves a function of establishing the story and separating enough between the generations of the sons of Noah, which we see in Genesis 10, and the coming of Abraham as the descendant of a specific line within the sons of Noah. So there's interconnectedness between all these different genealogies, but at the same time they function to establish a story that makes sense with the other elements that are being given. So Adam to the flood, you need people. From the flood to Abraham, you need people. And one of the key things that happens in the chapters between the flood and Abraham is the Tower of Babel, right? And the confusing of the languages. And then we get the story of the population of the earth, where the sons of Noah are listed with all their descendants that then make up the names of the nations of the earth. And this kind of establishes at the beginning of the Abraham cycle of stories, this populated earth that is then setting the stage for Abraham's family to be one people among many. And that kind of changes the narrative. Like if you didn't have any structure, if you didn't have any narrative flow from the flood, and you just said, and then there was this guy Abraham, then like you would be asking, wait a minute, where did this guy come from? What happens in between? Like, so it's a compositional thing that kind of carries the story forward. And it's obviously not the only way that you could compose something. Like, that's the way it is with compositions. Like, people make things in different ways, but it seems to be the technique that was used by whoever sewed together these stories in Genesis. That one way of doing is bridging them with genealogies that give us an idea of how we get from one point to the other.
Yeah, I would say it's also interesting. I mean, maybe you can disagree with me, I don't know, but it seems like maybe the Sumerian Kings list does something maybe similar. Like, if you look at it, it's like, okay, this is just a list. Like, Nani became king, he rolled for this. Bakeri he became king, he rolled for this. But in another way, it is telling a story, right? Maybe it's not connecting like it is in the Genesis text by just, I guess, not just like throwing in genealogies, but and I guess there is in the background of my head, I'm like, okay, these genealogy, I know better, but these genealogies, like, they're not just lists, right?
Right.
They do a lot more. So in our 21st century mindset, we might think, okay, these are just a list, but a lot more is going on in it. So yeah, that thought there. But yeah, thank you so much for explaining that. Did you have anything to add there, just real quick?
No, I think you're right. I think that we might tend to put genealogies in brackets, or kind of just jump past them or whatever. But I think they do a lot more, and I think that the text is a lot poorer if we just assume that they're just like filler material, but that they actually kind of serve to show continuity, and they serve to show connections, and they probably are a lot more important in the mind of I guess probably a pre-modern society than what we think of them as.
Interesting. Okay, so I did, real quick. So it sounds like you did watch the video I sent you about my interview with Dr. Gabriel, And he did mention that this first section here basically seems to be just straight added on. So like our earliest texts start around here, and they don't
Mhm.
mention anything about a flood. And then all of a sudden, and sometime in history, you get this other list that was an independent list, and then it was just added to the front, and you have this idea of the flood. So I'm curious what you had to think about that, specifically in regards to the text of Genesis, because the Genesis text, I guess, and modern readers will think like, oh, it's at the front, so that must just be the beginning of history, right? And then, just a continuous narrative, like this is what happened. But the Sumerian Kings list has no problem with just like throwing people up front, even if that wasn't, or maybe they did think it was specifically historically accurate, but that would be a really weird conclusion to come by, right? So I'm curious what you think about all of that, if you had anything to add on that.
Well, I mean, I think we have to ask the question about the function of the texts in different contexts. And so it's not surprising to find a list of the kings of Assyria, for example, that it has just a list of the kings that have been in Assyria. And it's not strange to find a list of the kings of Babylon, or and so like finding different kings lists isn't a strange phenomenon. And to find a list of kings in ancient Sumeria and the ancient Sumerian cities is also not a surprising thing. Now, the question is whether or not the first or the oldest examples were meant to try and create this grand narrative from the beginning of time all the way up until the present time to legitimize whoever or whatever.
Mhm.
And it seems like that the oldest text didn't have this, right? And that's the point that you're making. And what I think it says is that at some point somebody said, "Well, wait a minute, surely there was something before this," right? And so we do know that the flood narrative wasn't wildly popular until a certain point. It really grows in the old Babylonian period. Um, so it seems likely that that would have been a time when people started saying, "Hey, well these kings don't tell anything about what happened before the flood," and then they would say, "Oh, well then let's just tack on this bit." And whether or not then this section was composed to fill the space before the flood, or whether it was in existence, I don't think there are good enough arguments for either side, because we have I think there are good arguments that this was in circulation. So it seems to have been in circulation, not attached to the rest of the King's List. And it seems like the King's List was in circulation without the antediluvian portion. But whether or not this was actually composed specifically to fill that gap, or whether it was something that was created beforehand and somebody just said, "Oh, this fits very nicely right on top there," that I think is harder to say.
Mm.
But the important part is just that it does in the period when the flood seems to become this very popular concept. It seems to then start showing up on the manuscripts, on the tablets. And so it would be a time when people would say, "Oh, but what about the flood? And what happened before the flood?" And then somebody said, "Well, here you go. This is the list before the flood and up to it." And then that would also be why in some cases we actually see the name Ziusudra, who is the Sumerian flood hero, show up on the list. Like it would make sense that's included in some cases, but maybe it was developed in a context where the flood wasn't that important, and so then somebody didn't have that name in it. So like it's hard to say really how these traditions developed, but I think it shows us the developing traditions and how these things weren't stable. They weren't these they weren't seen as like holy copies that had to be copied perfectly or anything. This was a fluid text in the same way, and you could add to it by reconceiving of the structure of it as adding that bit that was earlier.
Yeah. Yeah. And do you think that something's going on with the Genesis text similarly? I mean, I'm not a scholar on the, documentary hypothesis or whatever,
Mm.
or what your even view is on that. But um, it seems like ancient writers didn't have a problem with just, chucking something at the front if they thought it was related to it, or maybe they thought it was historical, as we said. But
Well, I mean, I think like chucking something at the front is a little bit vulgar way of describing the composition of the Pentateuch, but I do think that there was I think that we just have to get rid of our notion that things were set in stone. Like the way the ancient writers or composers conceived of their writing was to put things together, not to like simply say that once it's written, it's stuck. Like it's there's no reason not to add something to the beginning, right? I mean, I have no problem with ideas of composition of the Pentateuch that have multiple sources that bring things together. Like, I don't think one person sat down at one time and wrote the whole thing. So therefore, I do have a view of a source-based view of the composition of the Pentateuch, and I think that is basically everyone today. The question is just how firm we see those sources as being collected as documents prior to their incorporation into the Pentateuch. And that's where we really differ, is whether or not we think there were one or two or three or four very clearly defined documents, or whether this happens in a more fluid, natural way. But I'm not sure that the genealogies were put in front of an empty or into an empty space. I think that probably came in as a part of a broader redaction process where there were many elements already there, and the genealogies then functioned kind of as something that made sense to add into the structure. Or that was at least used in the brain of someone who had knowledge of more, so they knew they had an idea of the creation of the world, or of the beginning of things, and they had an idea of the flood, had an idea of the Abraham piece to come, and these genealogies serve a function within that logic, whether they were purely added where nothing was, or whether there was an idea of how the genealogy looked or the people looked. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah, that's really, really fascinating. Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much. That's really all the questions I had. Did you have any other thoughts about this entire conversation that you think were worth adding, or maybe my audience would find interesting?
Well, I mean, I think it's like, I want to go back to one thing you brought up, was like kind of this idea that that me as a critical scholar is trying to I guess, I don't know, tear apart the Bible, or prove that it was forged, or prove that it was copied from Sumerian texts or something. And I think like that's one of those things that I want to just make like really clear, is that's not even what I was trying to say in my video at all. Like, and that's not what I would ever try to say. Literally my approach is to say that the Hebrew text is actually something special every time it gets done. Like, it's made into an Israelite or into a Hebrew version of things. And in this case, I would say that the evidence is much weaker for direct borrowing, but there's conceptual similarity. And so what we're talking about is not that the Bible was forged or copied or whatever, but it was developed as a Hebrew way of expressing ideas and concepts that were available to them in the ancient Near East, where they were interacting. And in this case, it's more debatable how exactly they came about those things, and what exactly they are. Where in other cases, I think it's pretty obvious that they borrow much more directly. And that's kind of part of the discussion that I want to have about the Bible being written backwards, is that there's a lot of different ways it comes to expression. Like, there is no like Sumerian version of the Bible that we could just like grab onto and say, here, it was just translated from this. Like, no, we're never going to find that, because what the Bible is actually a very specialized Hebrew thing, but it fits into a lot of different times, places, and cultures that we can study, and we can get an idea of how these things then were being developed and conceptualized and composed.
Awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you. Very important thoughts there. Yeah, I appreciate that. So it's not just looking at it as like, hey, you have your Christians that are just trying to defend the text, and then you have your whatever else critical scholars that are just trying to destroy it. Like, um, it's a lot more complicated than that, and when we're trying to look at the text for what it is, um, we shouldn't simply just assume like, hey, this person has like some bad bias against trying to destroy it, right?
Right.
Yeah. Well, I do really appreciate you coming on here, giving a more critical scholar viewpoint on these two different texts, or is that even a good way to put it? Two different texts, traditions of texts.
These many
And,
different texts. Yeah.
yeah. And it's been an absolute pleasure seeing how you work that out. Everybody should certainly subscribe to your channel, even Christians that
Especially
because
Christians.
especially Christians, right? There you go. Because Dr. Monger, he takes an approach to the text where you're going to miss so much if you just look at it from a conservative viewpoint. And a lot of the times, like some of the things you say is like positive for the Christian case. So it's not even something where we're like we should just like throw out everything in any way at all. But I really do appreciate your different perspective on this and your way of looking at it. So I do appreciate you coming on here. Is there anything other than your YouTube channel that'll be in the description that you want people to know about?
Nope. I'm good.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, as I said before, everybody should like and subscribe to his channel. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, man.